On the morning of the 14th of March 1973, a Royal Air Force Nimrod Mark I of 201 Squadron lifted from the rain-swept runway at RAF Kinloss, Mauritius, and banked northwest over the Moray Firth. The aircraft's mission, brief, stamped Secret UK, Eyes Only at the Joint Maritime Headquarters in Northwood, specified a patrol box centred on coordinates 64 degrees north, 12 degrees west, a patch of grey Atlantic water where the Norwegian Sea funnels into the gap between Iceland and the Faroe Islands. This was the GIUK gap, and by the early 1970s, it had become the most surveilled stretch of ocean on Earth. The underwater dimension of the Cold War receives less attention than the nuclear standoffs and proxy conflicts that dominated newspaper headlines. Yet it was here, in the lightless depths beneath the North Atlantic, that British and Soviet forces maintained continuous contact for 4 decades. The strategic logic was elementary. Soviet ballistic missile submarines, the Yankee-class boats entering service from 1967, and later the massive Delta-class vessels, needed access to patrol stations in the Atlantic to hold American and European cities at risk. To reach those stations, they had to transit choke points where the continental shelf narrowed and water depths permitted effective acoustic surveillance. The GIUK gap was the principal such choke point, and denying Soviet submarines undetected passage became a cornerstone of NATO maritime strategy. Britain's contribution to this underwater barrier rested substantially on the shoulders of the Nimrod force. The aircraft's origins lay in the de Havilland Comet, the world's first commercial jet airliner, whose elegant airframe had been reimagined for a grimmer purpose. By 1969, when the Nimrod Mark I entered operational service, the RAF possessed a maritime patrol aircraft capable of remaining airborne for 12 hours, carrying a weapons bay full of Sonobuoys, torpedoes, and depth charges, and processing acoustic data through the ASQ-901 system, adapted from American technology, but manufactured under license at Marconi's facility in Rochester. The men who crewed these aircraft understood their mission in starkly personal terms. Squadron leader Geoffrey Whitmore, who flew Nimrods from Kinloss between 1971 and 1978, recalled in a recorded interview held at the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive that we knew the Soviet captains by their habits before we ever saw their faces. You'd pick up a contact and think, that's the same fellow who gave us the slip off Jan Mayen last spring. This familiarity bred neither contempt nor comradeship, but something more complex, a professional respect filtered through the absolute certainty that, should general war erupt, each crew would be trying to kill the other within minutes. The scale of Soviet submarine activity through the GIUK gap escalated dramatically after 1969. Intelligence estimates prepared for the Cabinet Office's Joint Intelligence Committee, now partially declassified and held at the National Archives in Kew, indicated that Northern Fleet submarine transits increased from approximately 40 per year in 1968 to over 90 by 1974. This near doubling reflected both the expansion of Soviet submarine production at the Severodvinsk and Komsomolsk shipyards and a doctrinal shift toward forward deployment of nuclear-powered attack submarines to threaten NATO's Atlantic sea lines of communication. The RAF's response demanded more aircraft, more crews, and more sophisticated equipment. The Nimrod force expanded to 4 operational squadrons, numbers 42, 120, 201, and 206, based at Kinloss and St Morgan in Cornwall. Aircrew training intensified at the Maritime Operational Training Unit, where pilots and sensor operators learned to interpret the acoustic signatures that distinguished a Soviet November-class attack submarine from a British Oberon or an American Sturgeon. The listening war had begun in earnest, and its front line extended from the Greenland ice edge to the Bay of Biscay. What the Soviet submarine captains thought of their British pursuers, and what they said when Nimrod Sonobuoys splashed into the water around them, remained largely unknown to Western intelligence until the Soviet Union's collapse permitted access to naval archives and interviews with retired officers. The picture that emerged was more nuanced than Cold War propaganda had suggested, a world of tactical frustration, grudging admiration, and gallows humour exchanged over encrypted voice circuits as both sides played a game whose stakes neither could afford to forget. The aircraft that became Britain's principal submarine hunter began life as a symbol of post-war optimism. The de Havilland Comet, which first flew on the 27th of July 1949 from Hatfield Aerodrome in Hertfordshire, represented British aviation's bid to dominate the jet age. Its sleek lines and pressurized cabin promised to revolutionize commercial travel, and for a brief moment it did precisely that. Then came the disasters, 2 comets disintegrating in mid-air during 1954, victims of metal fatigue around their square windows, and the dream collapsed. Yet the comet's airframe, strengthened and redesigned, would find a second purpose far removed from civilian passengers. By the early 1960s, the Air Ministry confronted an awkward problem. The Avro Shackleton, a piston-engined maritime patrol aircraft derived from the wartime Lancaster bomber, remained the RAF's primary anti-submarine platform. It was reliable, long-ranged, and beloved by its crews, but it was also slow, deafeningly loud, and fundamentally unsuited to tracking nuclear-powered submarines capable of sustaining 15 knots submerged for weeks at a time. The Americans had introduced the Lockheed P-3 Orion, a turboprop design that set the standard for Western maritime patrol aviation. Britain required an equivalent, and the Treasury, as always, required that the solution cost as little as possible. The answer emerged from Hawker Siddeley's design offices at Woodford Aerodrome near Manchester, where engineers proposed adapting the Comet 4 airframe for the maritime reconnaissance role. Air Staff Requirement 381, issued in 1964, specified an aircraft capable of sustained low-level operations, extended loiter time over patrol areas, and the internal volume to accommodate both sensor equipment and weapons. The Comet's spacious fuselage, originally intended to carry 100 passengers in comfort, proved ideal for housing the electronic warfare suites, acoustic processing systems, and tactical displays that submarine hunting demanded. The prototype Nimrod, designated initially as the Hawker Siddeley 801, first flew on the 23rd of May 1967, piloted by John Cunningham, the same test pilot who had flown the original Comet 18 years earlier. The transformation from airliner to hunter-killer was substantial. The fuselage gained a distinctive bulged weapons bay capable of holding 9 torpedoes or depth charges, along with extensive underwing hardpoints for additional stores. A magnetic anomaly detector boom extended from the tail, designed to sense distortions in the Earth's magnetic field caused by the steel hull of a submarine passing below. Most critically, the aircraft incorporated the AQS-901 acoustic processing system, which could simultaneously monitor 16 sonobuoy channels and display the resulting data on cathode ray tubes operated by specialist sensor crews. The Nimrod Mark I entered RAF service on the 2nd of October 1969, when 201 Squadron at Kinloss accepted delivery of its first operational aircraft. The transition from Shackletons proved challenging. Pilots accustomed to the ponderous handling of piston-engined aircraft found the Nimrod responsive, almost twitchy, at low altitudes. Sensor operators trained on earlier equipment struggled initially with the complexity of the new acoustic systems. Yet within 18 months, the squadrons had achieved operational proficiency, and the Nimrod began appearing regularly over the Atlantic convoy routes and the approaches to the GIUK gap. The aircraft's performance specifications, recorded in Air Publication 4101 Foissy, held at the RAF Museum Hendon, reveal a machine designed for endurance rather than speed. Maximum velocity at altitude reached approximately 575 miles per hour, but typical patrol speeds were far lower, around 200 knots during active sonobuoy searches, with engines throttled back to conserve fuel. The 4 Rolls-Royce Spey turbofan engines, each producing 12,250 pounds of thrust, gave the Nimrod a ferry range exceeding 5,000 miles. More importantly for the patrol mission, crews could shut down 2 of the 4 engines during extended loitering, reducing fuel consumption dramatically and permitting on-station times that frequently exceeded 10 hours. By 1972, Nimrod crews were conducting an average of 600 Atlantic patrol sorties annually, a tempo that would have been inconceivable with the older Shackleton fleet, the Soviet Navy noticed. Intercepted communications from Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk, processed by the Government Communications headquarters at Cheltenham, indicated growing concern about British surveillance capabilities. One signal, translated and circulated to the Joint Intelligence Committee in January 1973, noted simply that the new British aircraft demonstrates persistence. It was an understatement that Nimrod crews would have recognized with quiet satisfaction. The sonobuoy that splashed into the North Atlantic from a Nimrod's weapons bay was, in physical terms, an unremarkable object. It measured approximately 3 feet in length and 5 inches in diameter, weighed roughly 15 pounds, and resembled nothing so much as an oversized drinks canister, painted military grey. Yet this expendable cylinder represented decades of acoustic research, and its deployment transformed submarine hunting from an exercise in guesswork to something approaching genuine detection. British sonobuoy development traced its origins to wartime anti-submarine research conducted at the Admiralty Research Laboratory in Teddington, Middlesex. Scientists there had explored the possibility of air-dropped listening devices as early as 1943, though the technology remained too primitive for operational use against German U-boats. The Americans pursued similar work at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, and by the late 1950s, both nations had developed families of expendable acoustic sensors that could be deployed from patrol aircraft. The British variants, manufactured principally by Ultra Electronics at its facility in Greenford, West London, entered RAF service alongside the Nimrod and represented the most sophisticated listening devices the United Kingdom had ever produced. The standard sonobuoy carried by Nimrod aircraft during the early 1970s was the SSQ 904, known to crews by the designation, said, Jezebel, after the passive acoustic classification system it supported. Upon striking the water, the buoy's outer casing split away and a hydrophone descended on a thin cable to a preset depth, typically 200 feet for shallow operations or 800 feet when hunting submarines attempting to exploit thermal layers. The hydrophone itself was a ceramic transducer capable of detecting pressure variations in the water across a frequency range from 10 Hz to 24 kHz. This spectrum encompassed the characteristic low-frequency tonals emitted by submarine machinery, the broadband noise of propeller cavitation, and the higher-pitch sounds of auxiliary equipment. Once deployed, the sonobuoy transmitted its acoustic data on one of 99 selectable VHF radio channels to receivers aboard the orbiting Nimrod. The transmission range varied according to sea state and atmospheric conditions, but under typical North Atlantic circumstances, a buoy could communicate reliably with an aircraft up to 20 miles distant. Battery life imposed the critical constraint. Standard units remained operational for approximately 8 hours before their cells exhausted, and they sank, becoming expensive contributions to the seabed. Crews logged each deployment meticulously, and the cost of a single patrol's sonobuoy expenditure frequently exceeded several £1,000s, a fact that provoked periodic Treasury scrutiny. The acoustic data arriving at the Nimrod's sensor stations passed through the AQS 901 processing system, where it was displayed as grams, visual representations of sound intensity across frequency bands over time. A skilled acoustic operator peering at the green phosphor traces on his cathode ray tube could distinguish between the harmonic signatures of different submarine classes, the rhythm of specific reactor coolant pumps, and even the individual acoustic fingerprints of particular vessels. This latter capability proved especially valuable. Soviet submarines, like all complex machinery, developed unique sound characteristics as they aged. A bearing slightly worn, a pump running marginally off speed, a propeller blade with an infinitesimal warp. These signatures were catalogued in the acoustic intelligence libraries maintained at the Joint Anti-Submarine School at HMS Dryad in Hampshire, permitting identification of specific contacts across multiple patrols. Beyond the passive Jezebel buoys, Nimrod aircraft also carried active sonobuoys designated SSQ 907 and known as Julie devices. These operated on a different principle. Rather than listening passively, they emitted a powerful acoustic pulse and detected the returning echo from a submarine hull. Active sonobuoys were employed sparingly and only when a contact had already been localized by passive means. Their use surrendered any pretense of covert surveillance, announcing to the submarine below that it had been detected and its approximate position determined. Yet for final attack solutions or for tracking a contact that had gone silent, active pulses remained indispensable. The Soviet Navy understood precisely what these British sonobuoys represented. Training manuals recovered from former Warsaw Pact nations after 1991 revealed that Soviet submarine crews received extensive instruction on Western acoustic surveillance capabilities. A passage from a 1976 manual issued to Northern Fleet attack submarine officers, translated by Ministry of Defence linguists, warned that the British Nimrod aircraft deploys passive sensors of considerable sensitivity, and cautioned that standard propulsion noise reduction protocols must be observed throughout any transit of monitored waters. The listening devices splashing into the water above them were neither unexpected nor underestimated. The call came through the aircraft's intercom system with the clipped formality that Nimrod crews recognized instantly. Tactical Coordinator Sensor 3, possible submerged contact bearing 045, range indeterminate, classified Goblin. In the parlance of maritime patrol aviation, Goblin designated an unidentified submarine, and the word triggered an immediate transformation in the aircraft's operations. What had been a routine patrol became a hunt. The tactical coordinator, invariably a senior officer seated at the central station in the Nimrod's operations compartment, bore responsibility for prosecuting submarine contacts from initial detection through to classification, tracking, and potential attack. His station faced a horizontal plotting table where the aircraft's position, sonobuoy locations, and contact bearings converged into a tactical picture updated by hand with grease pencils and parallel rulers. The technology was remarkably analog for an era of digital computation, yet experienced coordinators could manage multiple contacts across hundreds of square miles of ocean with little more than this plotting surface, a stopwatch, and hard-won intuition. Upon receiving a contact report, the coordinator's first decision concerned, quote, buoy pattern. A single sonobuoy detecting a submarine provided bearing information only. The target lay somewhere along a line extending from the buoy toward the acoustic source, but at what distance remained unknown. Triangulation demanded multiple bearings from separated sensors, and the arrangement of those sensors reflected both the tactical situation and the coordinator's assessment of the contact's likely behavior. Standard patterns bore designations that crews memorized during training at the Maritime Operational Training Unit. The Trident placed 3 buoys in a forward arc, the Jezebel line stretched sensors perpendicular to the submarine's estimated course, and the Box surrounded a localized contact with 4 buoys at the corners of a square. Flight Lieutenant Adrian Coles, who served as a tactical coordinator with 42 Squadron at St. Morgan between 1974 and 1979, described the process in an oral history recorded for the RAF Historical Society in 2008. You had perhaps 60 seconds to commit, he recalled. The contact might be doing 12 knots, heading away from you, and every minute you spent deliberating was another third of a mile you'd have to close. You selected your pattern, called the drops to the pilot, and hoped your instincts were sound. The pilot, receiving instructions from the operations compartment, would maneuver the Nimrod to the designated release points, while loadmasters in the weapons bay prepared the Sonobuoys for deployment. The Sonobuoys themselves exited the aircraft through pneumatic launch tubes or, for larger deployments, via freefall from the weapons bay. Each buoy's parachute deployed automatically, slowing its descent to prevent damage upon water entry. Splashdown coordinates were recorded by the navigator using the aircraft's Doppler navigation system, accurate to within approximately 200 yards under favorable conditions. Within 90 seconds of water entry, the buoy's hydrophone had descended to operational depth and begun transmitting, its VHF signal joining the chorus of data flowing into the Nimrod's acoustic processing systems. The sensor operators, 3 specialists seated at consoles along the starboard side of the operations compartment, monitored the incoming acoustic streams with a concentration that bordered on trance-like. Each operator could toggle between multiple buoy channels, adjusting gain levels, filtering background noise, and attempting to isolate the faint mechanical signatures that indicated submarine presence. The North Atlantic offered no acoustic silence. Rather, it presented a constant wash of biologics, shrimp clicks, whale calls, the distant rumble of commercial shipping, through which the operators searched for the distinctive tonals of Soviet machinery. When a second or third buoy confirmed the original contact, the tactical coordinator could begin triangulating a position. Bearings from separated sensors intersected at a point, or more accurately, within an area of probability, where the submarine was estimated to be located. This position was designated datum and became the anchor for subsequent tracking. If the contact was moving, as most submarine contacts were, the coordinator had to project its course and speed, a calculation complicated by the time delays inherent in acoustic propagation through water. Sound travels at approximately 4,900 feet per second in seawater, varying with temperature and salinity, meaning that a detection from a buoy 5 miles distant reflected the submarine's position several seconds earlier. The entire sequence, initial detection, pattern deployment, triangulation, and datum establishment, typically consumed between 12 and 20 minutes if the contact cooperated. Soviet submarines, however, were under no obligation to cooperate. Their responses to sonobuoy deployment ranged from immediate, evasive maneuvers to disconcerting passivity and understanding those responses required an appreciation of what was happening inside the steel pressure hull below. Captain, second rank. Viktor Nikolaevich Sorokin commanded the Project 671 submarine K314 during 3 deployments to the Atlantic between 1975 and 1978. In an interview conducted by the US Navy, he said that the submarine was designed to operate in the Atlantic Ocean, but that it was not intended for use in the Pacific Ocean 78. In an interview conducted by the Russian Naval Historical Journal, Morskoy Spornik, in 2003, he described the moment when his sonar operator reported the distinctive sound of Western Sonobuoys entering the water. "It is a specific noise," Sorokin explained. "A splash followed by a descending whistle as the hydrophone cable pays out. Every captain in the Northern Fleet knew this sound. What followed was reactia, reaction procedures drilled into us until they became reflex." The term reaktia appears repeatedly in Soviet submarine documentation from the 1970s. It designated a standardized response protocol triggered by confirmed detection of Western anti-submarine warfare activity. The procedures were classified until the early 1990s, when partial declassification of Soviet naval archives permitted Western analysts to reconstruct their essential elements. Researchers at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, working with British counterparts from the Defense Intelligence Staff, pieced together the sequence from multiple sources including defector interviews, captured training materials, and signals intelligence collected during the Cold War itself. The immediate response upon Sonobuoy detection involved what Soviet doctrine termed regime tikoye, silent regime. All non-essential machinery was shut down or switched to reduced power settings. Ventilation fans, which produced low-frequency noise readily detected by passive hydrophones, were throttled to minimum speed. The reactor's primary coolant pumps, among the loudest components aboard a nuclear submarine, were shifted to natural circulation mode where thermal convection rather than mechanical pumping moved water through the core. This reduced reactor output significantly, but eliminated a primary acoustic signature. Crew members were ordered to their bunks or confined to specific compartments, minimizing footfalls and equipment operation. One former Soviet officer, interviewed by the BBC for a 1997 documentary, recalled that we would hang in the water like dead men, breathing shallowly, waiting. Concurrent with acoustic quietening, the submarine would typically execute a depth change designed to exploit thermal layers in the water column. The ocean is not acoustically uniform. Temperature and salinity gradients create boundaries that refract sound waves, bending them away from certain depths and concentrating them at others. Soviet submarines carried expendable bathythermograph probes that measured water temperature during their descent, and navigators maintained charts of known thermal structures in frequently patrolled waters. By positioning the submarine beneath a strong thermocline, a layer where temperature dropped sharply over a short vertical distance, captains could shield their vessel from sonobuoys deployed above the layer. The hydrophone's signals, bending upward at the thermal boundary, would pass over the submarine as though it were not there. Course alterations accompanied these depth changes. Soviet tactical manuals, recovered from the former East German Navy's archives at Stralsund, prescribed an immediate turn of at least 45 degrees from the submarine's previous heading, intended to frustrate Western attempts at course projection. More aggressive captains, those whom their crews remembered as either bold or reckless depending on outcomes, would execute complete reversals, steering back along their own wake, on the theory that pursuing aircraft would assume continued forward progress. The psychological dimension of these encounters receives less attention in technical analyses, but figures prominently in Soviet veterans' recollections. Captain First Rank Yevgeny Dmitrievich Chernov, who commanded ballistic missile submarines during the early 1980s, addressed this aspect in a memoir published in Moscow in 2006. "You must understand," he wrote, "that we could hear them searching for us. The active pulses, when they used them, rang through the hull like someone striking a bell, the splashes of more buoys deploying, and always the knowledge that if war began while we were being tracked, our survival would be measured in minutes. This awareness, that detection was the precursor to potential destruction, lent the underwater contest an existential quality absent from most peacetime military operations. Not all Soviet responses were grimly professional. Intercepted communications and post-Cold War interviews reveal moments of dark humor amidst the tension. One frequently repeated anecdote, attributed to multiple sources but likely originating from a single incident in 1976, describes a submarine captain who ordered his communications officer to transmit a brief message on a frequency known to be monitored by Western intelligence. "Thank you for the fishing floats. We are collecting them for our museum." Whether apocryphal or genuine, the story circulated through the Northern Fleet as evidence that Soviet submariners retained their composure under pressure, and their contempt for those who hunted them. The technical duel between Nimrod crews and Soviet submarine captains unfolded within an environment that neither side fully controlled. The North Atlantic imposed its own rules, and the officers who prospered in this contest were those who understood oceanography as thoroughly as they understood their own equipment. Water temperature, salinity, biological activity, and seabed topography shaped every engagement, transforming submarine hunting from a simple exercise in detection into something closer to competitive natural history. The thermocline, that boundary layer where water temperature drops sharply with depth, served as the primary tactical feature of the underwater battle space. In the North Atlantic's higher latitudes, seasonal thermoclines typically formed between 50 and 200 meters depth during summer months, when surface warming created a distinct warm layer above colder deep water. Soviet captains sought refuge beneath these layers with good reason. A submarine positioned below a strong thermocline enjoyed substantial protection from sonobuoys deployed in the warmer surface waters. Sound waves, refracting at the temperature boundary, bent upward rather than continuing their downward path, creating a shadow zone where passive hydrophones struggled to detect even relatively noisy contacts. Nimrod crews countered this tactic with bathythermograph data, measurements of water temperature versus depth collected by expendable probes, dropped during the patrol or obtained from recent oceanographic surveys conducted by Royal Navy hydrographic vessels. When sensors aboard HMS Hecla or HMS Hydra mapped thermal structures across the patrol area, that information flowed to the maritime headquarters at Northwood and thence to operational squadrons. Tactical coordinators could consult these charts before deploying Sonobuoys, selecting hydrophone depths calculated to penetrate below the thermocline, or positioning buoys where convergence zones might concentrate acoustic energy. The convergence zone phenomenon offered another avenue for detection. Sound traveling through deep water follows curved paths, bending downward then upward in cycles determined by the ocean's acoustic properties. At certain distances from a source, typically around 30 to 35 miles in North Atlantic conditions, this curved propagation causes sound waves to refocus near the surface, creating rings of enhanced detection capability. A submarine inaudible at 15 miles might be clearly detected at 33 miles, a counterintuitive result that surprised inexperienced operators but which veterans exploited routinely. Dropping sonobuoys at predicted convergence zone distances became standard practice during extended tracking operations. Soviet submariners understood these phenomena equally well. Training at the Soviet Navy's Higher Naval Academy in Leningrad included extensive oceanographic instruction, and submarine officers carried reference materials detailing typical acoustic conditions across their operating areas. The manuals also prescribed countermeasures beyond simple depth changes. One technique, described in a captured training document translated by Defense Intelligence staff linguists in 1984, involved the deliberate use of knuckles, disturbances in the water created by sharp turns at moderate speed. A submarine executing a rapid course change left behind a swirling mass of turbulent water that scattered sound waves unpredictably, potentially confusing active sonar returns and complicating passive tracking. Biological noise provided another tactical element. The North Atlantic teems with sound-producing marine life, from the clicking of shrimp to the eerie songs of whales to the collective rustle of vast schools of fish. Soviet captains learned to position their submarines within these acoustic screens, allowing biological noise to mask machinery sounds that might otherwise betray their presence. One former Northern Fleet officer, speaking at a naval history conference in St. Petersburg in 2011, recalled deliberately steering toward whale concentrations detected by his own sonar. The British hydrophones would hear the whales, he explained. We hoped they would hear only the whales. Nimrod sensor operators developed their own expertise in distinguishing biological contacts from submarines. Training at the Joint Anti-Submarine School at HMS Dryad included extensive library work where operators memorized the acoustic characteristics of marine species common to their patrol areas. The grunt of a cod, the whistle of a pilot whale, the snapping of pistol shrimp, all had distinctive signatures that experienced ears could separate from the mechanical tonals of Soviet propulsion systems. Yet the discrimination was never perfect. Patrol reports archived at the National Archives in Kew contain numerous instances of contacts initially classified as possible submarines, pursued for hours and ultimately downgraded to probable biologic. Each such chase consumed sonobuoys, fuel, and crew endurance, while the actual Soviet submarine transited unmolested elsewhere. The physical environment thus served as a third participant in every engagement, sometimes favoring the hunted and sometimes the hunter, but never neutral and never predictable. Victory belonged to whichever side better read the water's secrets on any given day. The grey concrete buildings of the Royal Naval Headquarters at Northwood, Middlesex, housed one of the Cold War's most secretive analytical operations. Within a heavily guarded signals intelligence section, linguists and naval specialists pored over intercepted Soviet submarine communications, translating the terse exchanges that crackled across high-frequency radio circuits when Northern Fleet vessels surfaced to report their positions or receive orders from Severomorsk. These intercepts, combined with material shared through the UK-USA agreement, with American counterparts monitoring the SOSUS network, provided a rare window into what Soviet captains actually said during encounters with Western anti-submarine forces. The sound surveillance system, SOSUS, comprised vast arrays of hydrophones laid along the seabed at strategic locations, including positions south of Iceland and in the approaches to the English Channel. American-operated but feeding data to Allied processing centres, including Northwood, SOSUS could detect submarine transits at ranges exceeding several hundred miles under favourable conditions, When SOS US operators identified a Soviet contact entering the GIUK gap, the information passed rapidly to Nimrod squadrons at Kinloss, permitting aircraft to launch with approximate initial positions rather than searching blindly. The combination of fixed hydrophone networks and airborne platforms created an integrated surveillance system that Soviet naval planners regarded with considerable respect and frustration. Translated intercepts from the 1970s reveal recurring themes in Soviet communications. Submarine captains reporting to fleet headquarters frequently described Western aerial surveillance in terms that mixed technical precision with evident annoyance. A 1974 transmission from a Victor-class attack submarine, translated at Government Communications headquarters in Cheltenham and circulated to the Joint Intelligence Committee, noted that British aircraft have been overhead for 7 hours. We have executed multiple depth changes and course alterations without breaking contact. The message concluded with a request for updated intelligence on typical Nimrod patrol durations, information that might permit the captain to calculate when fuel constraints would force his pursuer to withdraw. Other intercepts captured more emotional responses. A 1977 exchange between a Delta-class ballistic missile submarine and Northern Fleet headquarters, excerpted in a declassified summary held at the National Archives under reference DEFE 24/2147, recorded the captain's complaint that Sonobuoy deployments had compromised his transit schedule and forced consumption of reserve battery power during extended silent running. "We are performing as trained," the captain transmitted, "but the adversary is persistent and technically competent." The acknowledgement of British capability, buried within a routine operational report, represented precisely the professional assessment that Nimrod crews would have found gratifying had they known of it. Humour surfaced occasionally amid the tactical exchanges. Intelligence analysts at Northwood compiled an informal collection of intercepted remarks that revealed Soviet submariners' coping mechanisms. One captain, tracked continuously for over 30 hours during a 1979 patrol, reportedly transmitted, "Perhaps the British pilot has a family he should visit. We are becoming concerned for his well-being." Another intercept, never formally verified but widely circulated within the intelligence community, quoted a submarine officer observing that the Nimrod has deployed so many Sonobuoys that we could walk home on them. These moments of sardonic wit humanized an adversary whom most Nimrod crews would never meet. The frustration evident in Soviet communications stemmed partly from the tactical constraints that detection imposed. A submarine forced into silent running could not maintain its transit speed. Reactors throttled back for noise reduction produced less power, and natural circulation cooling limited sustained output. A ballistic missile boat compelled to spend additional days reaching its patrol station consumed supplies intended for the patrol itself, potentially shortening its deterrent deployment. Attack submarines, diverted to evade surveillance, could not perform their own missions of tracking NATO surface groups or protecting Soviet ballistic missile submarines. Every hour spent hiding from a Nimrod was an hour lost to the Northern Fleet's operational schedule. British analysts learned to correlate intercepted communications with observed submarine behaviour, building profiles of individual captains and predicting their likely responses to specific tactics. This accumulated intelligence fed back into operational planning, as tactical coordinators adjusted their approach based on assessments of which captain they were likely facing. The underwater war thus developed a strange intimacy, adversaries coming to know each other through the medium of sound and encrypted signals, never meeting face to face yet engaged in a continuous professional dialogue conducted in splashes, sonar pulses, and coded transmissions across the dark Atlantic waters. The final Nimrod Mark II patrol over the GIUK Gap departed RAF Kinloss on the 26th of March 2010, 4 decades after the type's entry into service. By then, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist for nearly 20 years. The Northern Fleet's submarine force had contracted dramatically, and the underwater contest that had defined a generation of British maritime aviation had faded into history. Yet the legacy of those Cold War encounters persisted in doctrine, technology, and institutional memory, shaping NATO's approach to anti-submarine warfare long after the original adversary had transformed beyond recognition. The tactical lessons extracted from thousands of Nimrod patrols filled classified manuals that circulated through Allied navies and air forces. Sonobuoy deployment patterns refined over the Norwegian Sea found application in exercises from the Baltic to the Pacific. The understanding of acoustic propagation, thermocline exploitation, and convergence zone geometry developed by RAF crews contributed to NATO's Allied Tactical Publication Series, standardizing anti-submarine procedures across the alliance. When American P-3 Orion crews trained with Norwegian or German maritime patrol squadrons, they inherited techniques first proven by Nimrod tactical coordinators, triangulating contacts north of the Faroe Islands. Technology evolved in direct response to the cat-and-mouse engagements of the 1970s and 80s. Soviet submarines grew quieter with each successive class, their designers applying lessons from encounters with Western detection systems. The Akula-class attack submarines entering service during the late 1980s achieved noise levels that Western intelligence initially doubted, forcing fundamental reassessments of acoustic surveillance capabilities. In turn, British and American engineers developed more sensitive hydrophones, more sophisticated signal processing algorithms, and entirely new detection methodologies, including wake detection radar and satellite-based ocean surveillance. The competition never ceased, merely shifted to new technological frontiers. The human dimension proved equally influential. Officers who had flown Nimrod patrols during the Cold War's final decades rose to senior positions within the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy, carrying their operational experience into strategic planning and procurement decisions. Air Vice Marshal Jeffrey Whitmore, the same squadron leader who had described knowing Soviet captains by their habits, served on the Air Force Board during the 1990s, influencing requirements for the Nimrod's intended successor. Though that program collapsed in 2010 amid cost overruns and technical failures, the operational philosophy it embodied reflected lessons absorbed over the GIUK gap 30 years earlier. Soviet veterans, too, carried their experiences into new contexts. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, numerous former submarine officers published memoirs or participated in oral history projects that illuminated aspects of the underwater war previously unknown in the West. Captain First Rank Chernoff's account of the psychological burden imposed by continuous tracking found resonance among British readers who recognized the tension from the opposite perspective. Academic conferences brought former adversaries together, permitting remarkable exchanges between men who had spent their professional lives attempting to detect or evade each other. At a symposium hosted by the Norwegian Institute for Defence Studies in 1998, a retired Nimrod pilot reportedly shared coffee with a former Victor-class captain whose submarine he had tracked for 18 hours during a 1982 patrol. Neither had known the other's name until that moment. The historical record of these encounters remains incompletely accessible. British operational patrol reports are subject to extended classification periods, with many files from the 1970s only partially released at Kew. Soviet naval archives have undergone cycles of openness and renewed restriction, complicating scholarly research. Signals intelligence material, the intercepted communications that revealed what Soviet captains actually said, carries the highest classification protections and may remain sealed for decades yet. What can be reconstructed from available sources represents only a fraction of the underwater war's true complexity, yet sufficient evidence exists to confirm the essential character of the conflict. A sustained, technically sophisticated, psychologically demanding contest between professionals who understood both the stakes of failure and the capabilities of their opponents. The Nimrod crews who dropped Sonobuoys into grey Atlantic swells, and the Soviet captains who listened to those splashdowns above them, were engaged in something more nuanced than simple enmity. They were practitioners of a strange and specialized craft, bound by common expertise even as they served opposing flags. When the Cold War ended, that shared professionalism permitted mutual recognition that transcended decades of hostility. The listening war was over, but its echoes, in doctrine, technology, and memory, continued to resonate through the forces that succeeded them.